Hello, you are watching Kazinform's guests. Today's our guest, Sir Suma Chakrabarti, an advisor to the President of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Sir Suma, thank you for taking the time to meet with us.
My pleasure.
I would like to start our interview with economic consequences of COVID-19. How the pandemic has changed the world economy. After all, a new variant of the coronavirus, the Omicron, is spreading in the world, and which is also beginning to affect the world economy. Flights are suspending, for instance.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It has affected the world economy very deeply. We know that back in 2020, the world economy contracted by 3.5%. That's a big contraction in the world economy. And most markets, including many in this region, also contracted as well. So growth was affected, and when growth is affected, of course, jobs are affected. Then on top of that, we know about the health outcomes, really, so many sad losses of life, but we also know about the education outcomes. I am very worried that the lost education for many of our young people through the last 2 years, it's a big learning loss, and it means that we have to do more to try and help them catch up, because otherwise we could risk having a sort of lost generation, if you like. And I think another thing that we have to understand is that all the gains that we were making, for example, having more women employed in many countries, well, they were the last people into jobs, therefore the first out, because often firms, companies try to retain their more experienced workers and will lose their newer workers, and that has affected many women in jobs, and I think that's meant growing inequality as well. So these are all very bad implications. I think there's been implications also for tourism and the travel industry in many countries as well. So that's worrying me a lot. There are one or two things that have changed, of course, and one thing I think we should mention is the way we work. We used to talk about the future of work a lot, and the future of work is going to be much more digital. Well, that arrived already. And I think we can expect, therefore, a more hybrid way of working in the future, a mixture of people coming to the offices like we used to, but also working much more from home and from other places in using digital technology. And I think digital is going to be much more part of our lives now going forward. We also have seen, I think, many of the supply chains, the global supply chains, become much more localized. And I think, therefore, the trend we had over the last 30 years of a globalized supply chain, that has been sort of slowed down, if anything, and you will see much more localization, I think, going forward. All of these are really big changes. I would make one final point that we in Kazakhstan and other countries have to be ready for. In the last 30 years, many of the credit rating agencies had begun to think about issues like climate change. So they would rate a country like Kazakhstan, like the other countries in Central Asia. What are they doing about climate change? That would be part of the rating of that country, and it would help determine the rating, the investment grade of that country. I think because now many people believe these pandemics will recur. It's not just one. It will come back and it'll be part of our normal lives. And I think, therefore, a bit like climate change, I think we can expect rating agencies, slowly maybe, but they will surely also start to look at countries to see how they're responding through their health systems, how resilient they will be in tackling these sort of pandemics. And that will become part of the rating of those countries. So we in Kazakhstan, we really need to make sure our health system for the future is resilient, because it will not just affect the health of our citizens, but it also affects, of course, the way credit rating agencies perceive us as well, and that has an economic impact too. So the big implications, I think, from what has happened in the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm. And it should be noted that regions of Kazakhstan have so far left the COVID red zone. And how do you assess Kazakhstan's initiatives and measures to combat coronavirus?
Well, I think it's actually after, shall we say, a little slow start at the beginning, it's become very good in the last few months. I really pay a lot of tribute to the government for the way it has tackled this in the last few months. We have now a large number of people vaccinated, double vaccinated. I think 8.2 million now in Kazakhstan have had both jabs. That's really important. So we have more, what I would say, herd immunity. It doesn't mean you won't get COVID. You can still get COVID, even if you have 2 vaccinations. But it means the effects will be milder. And that's important for health, for the economy as well. And of course, we have seen the government actively purchasing vaccines. We hope that Kazakh will get, will be approved by the WHO very soon. That's actually quite an important thing also for Kazakh science, to have that validated by WHO. And we've seen the capacity of our hospitals in Kazakhstan grow as well. So I think the reason and the good news that we're out of the red zone in the regions, the reason is actually the acceleration of the vaccination program. And that's been important. And it's been important to the growth rate this year, that we've had 3.6, 3.7% growth this year. Part of the reason has been the vaccination program.
Thank you. And how has the pandemic affected the investment volume, in particular investments in our country?
Yeah, well, obviously there are a lot of other things going on, not just the pandemic, in affecting investment levels. And this is a country that's been very dominated by the natural resources sector, oil and gas and mining and so on. And that sector was being affected anyway by the prices in the past, although gas prices are rising, but oil prices were depressed for a long time. And of course, also many more investors are looking at the application of ESG principles. So that was also impacting on investment. But then the pandemic hit and it made things worse. And so globally, not just Kazakhstan, globally foreign direct investment fell very heavily, very sharply in 2020. I think the fall was something like 35% in 2020. That's a really sharp fall. And that's mostly due to the pandemic. And there's been some rebound, clearly, in 2021, in Kazakhstan, of course, but also in other regions as well of the world. In 2020, it's quite terrible to think, but it's true that FDI in Kazakhstan fell. I think it was down to $17 billion, which is a fall of 30% on 2019. The good news is that in the first half of 2021, FDI in Kazakhstan is already 11 billion. That's, I think, some 30% higher than the same first half of the year in 2020. So there's been a good rebound. We need to keep that going, going forward. And that means we have to do more to improve the investment climate in Kazakhstan. And it means particularly, I think we should use more the AIFC, the Astana International Financial Center, which has been very successful. It, I think, got $6 billion worth of new investment in Kazakhstan in the last 3 years. So it's actually been a big part of the success story of the rebound. And I think the more we can use AIFC to give investors confidence in English common law, in application of rule of law for dispute resolution, and just the ecosystem around the AIFC, the more we will succeed in getting more investment to Kazakhstan.
And which countries are more focused on investing in Kazakhstan? How Kazakhstan attracts foreign investors?
So because the economy has been dominated by the natural resources sector, oil, gas, mining, it's not surprising that the big investors, if you take the last 15 years, has been Netherlands and US. Yeah, that's not surprising. Many of the oil companies are based there as well. Switzerland actually also has been a major investor in this country too. But most of that FDI went to those sectors, natural resources, to manufacturing and to trade. Now, they chose Kazakhstan for some good reasons, which we need to hang on to. Political stability, the strategic location of Kazakhstan between Russia and China, between 2 big markets. It's been very, very important to us, I think, as well. And I think they also, because of the AIFC, as I said earlier, the growth of the AIFC platform in the last few years, that also meant we got a lot more investment from them. What we now need to do, though, is find new investors in new countries to come into new sectors, not just traditional sectors, because we want to diversify the economy.
Mm-hmm. Sir Suma, you are the Deputy Chairman of the Supreme Council for Reforms under the President of Kazakhstan. And what issues do you initiate and promote at the Council?
So the Council has been very, very active. I think we've had some 7 meetings now. It's been very active in its first year. We looked at the National Development Plan 2025, the Territorial Development Plan, very important. We looked at the national projects, these great projects which cover economic as well as social sphere. We looked at public administration. We've also pushed privatization. We've looked at how to improve business regulation, which is actually very important as well. And in my case, particularly, we have several consultative committees. I have chaired the Consultative Committee on Macroeconomic Policy. We've had recommendations which has been approved by the Supreme Council on how to improve economic growth, how to have better fiscal and monetary policy, how to get the banking sector moving again, the capital market, and also we've looked at the National Fund and the Pension Fund as well. So the management strategies of those funds. So we've been very active in that consultative committee as well. And we've involved international experts in my work, bringing them in, getting them to comment. And what we now have to do, and this has been one of the big issues in Kazakhstan in the past, we've always been quite good at strategy in Kazakhstan. It's delivery, it's implementation that we really have to make sure happens. And we have to be honest about what is being delivered, and where progress isn't happening, we have to go back and ask, why isn't it happening? What can we do to correct it, and so on? Because in the end, this council isn't there just to have nice discussions and so on. It's there to approve things which will then get implemented and make the lives of every Kazakhstani better. That's what we want. So we've got to really make sure delivery takes place. And that's really the task of government, of course, not of the Supreme Council. But I think it's been working for a year now. We're continually trying to improve the way it works. And the discussions are getting more interactive and more lively as well, and a bit longer, which is actually good. So I'm really hopeful that the Supreme Council is going to continue working this way. And it's very well chaired by the President. He likes to listen to the debates before he decides something. So I think it's actually a good new model for the way decisions might be taken in Kazakhstan.
As you mentioned, on the 7th of December, President Tokayev held the meeting of the Supreme Council, and the social code now is being developed in Kazakhstan. How do you comment on this issue?
So these social issues are always very sensitive, always very difficult. They affect every single citizen, of course, and we have several challenges. By 2030, we know we have a demographic challenge, we have a social, economic challenge, including the imbalance in our demography. It's quite interesting. I think because we're an upper middle income country in Kazakhstan, that we're beginning to see some of the same issues that are affecting Eastern Europe, for example, the more advanced market economies. And things like the population is aging more. And so in the rest of Central Asia, their main problem is they've got a very young population. And we have that too, but we have a growing percentage of elderly in this country. So that's another big challenge for us going forward. And the amount of spending on the vulnerable populations, on social support, has been really, really rising a lot. And labour productivity should be higher as well. So some 5 million recipients in Kazakhstan get social support. 5 million. That's what, about a quarter of the population? A bit more than a quarter of the population? That's a lot. So what we discussed in the Supreme Council was creating a more unified framework, a more integrated model. At the moment, if you're a citizen receiving these various supports, you will be receiving it from all different places, and you have to interact with each different agency in doing it. We want it to be the other way around, whereby the agencies interact directly with you, not you with every agency. Make it simpler for the citizen. So you have a more integrated approach, I think, to social support. You have more proactive approach by the public services, who will go and find you rather than you have to find them. And I think we'll also simplify the business processes as well and modernize the pension system. So I think at the end of this, we're going to end up with a system which is more compliant and in line with ILO, International Labour Organization standards. And that is important because I think, Kazakhstan increasingly, as it's become more wealthy, rightly, in my view, wants to reach the same standards, that are average standards for OECD, for ILO, and this is good. So this social code reforms will help in that area to reach those standards. Again, again, implementation is going to be important. The other thing we will have to look at in time is this aging population issue. You know, in some countries in the West, in North America, Western Europe, they've had to have a more open immigration policy to allow to have younger workers to fill jobs as the population ages. The economics of that is obvious, that it's what you should do, and I come from a country, UK, which did that a lot. But the politics of that is very difficult because, the indigenous population gets can get upset with more foreign workers coming in. So the economics points one way, the politics can be much more difficult and point a different way. So managing that debate is going to be really important, but it's a debate we have to have. You can't avoid these difficult choices. No country can avoid them. Kazakhstan is not alone. But I was really impressed. I thought this week's Supreme Council was one of the best. Very interactive, very engaged debate on these matters.
And also, in your opinion, what areas, what spheres should Kazakhstan develop deeply?
Yeah, I mean, so this, first of all, the national projects will already be looking at a whole range of sectors. And so I think the next year the Supreme Council will need to see what is working with national projects and what isn't working, learn lessons. So we have to track that. It's about delivery, so it's really the task of the government, of course, to do that, but then for the President and the Supreme Council to understand. And national projects cover everything nearly, so I think that's important. They cover education, healthcare, all the economic issues as well. If I was to say where I think diversification of the economy should go, and I think it's important, we should debate this, I think agriculture, I think tourism, I think transportation are three areas where Kazakhstan has potential. Why I say transportation? Because of our strategic location between Russia and China, it's actually a very, very good place to think about logistics because we can actually serve the other big markets as well. Agriculture, every Kazakhstani knows because everyone, even if they say they're now from NUR-SULTAN or Almaty, their families originally were from a much more rural background. And so agriculture has enormous potential, but we've not really developed it as yet because of our focus on natural resources, on mining and oil and gas. So agriculture, I think, has great potential. And I think tourism also has potential, but we have to crack some things. At the moment, Kazakhstan's tourism is pretty much high-end, very expensive type tourism, but yet the hotels outside Almaty and Nur-Sultan really don't cater for the modern type of tourist. You will not find young European, Japanese, Indian backpackers in Kazakhstan. They don't come here. And partly they don't come because they don't know about the history, which is sad. We have to do better on teaching people around the world about the great history of this country, but also language. We need hotels which cater for that segment of tourism, and we also need those English to be much more widespread, the English language, because that will then make it easier for tour operators to bring people like that to this country. So we have to diversify our tourism within tourism to get more people to come. I think the development of Turkestan has been a great thing to do. And that is also a potential for engaging, collaborating with the Uzbekistan as well, because you could easily see people going to Samarkand, Bukhara, but also Turkestan as part of a package when they come from abroad. And I think that's a great join between the two countries.
Mm-hmm. And so let me ask about Uzbekistan, also the cooperation with Uzbekistan. We know that President of Uzbekistan, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, visited Kazakhstan just recently. And how do you assess the cooperation between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in general?
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm also advisor to the President of Uzbekistan as well. And I was really delighted to see this visit taking place. I think it went very well. I've heard from both Nur-Sultan and Tashkent that they both thought the visit was very good. I think the two economies are quite complementary. I mean, the Uzbek economy has a lot of industry from the Soviet days, So it's a bit more diversified than the Kazakh economy, but much poorer. So Uzbekistan is still a lower middle income country, whereas Kazakhstan is an upper middle income country. So I think because it's complementary, I think the opportunity for cooperation is much higher. They're not competing against each other for the same things. So I think there's mutually beneficial cooperation, I would say, much more partnership rather than competition. And it was wonderful to see, I think, $6.6 billion worth of joint initiatives signed between the two countries. I was very pleased to see that. And some of those were ideas I had been pushing with both countries, so I'm very pleased with that. And I thought that one of the highlights for me was President Mirziyoyev came to the Office of the Digital Government, the Digital Center, where he heard also about AIFC and the new Agency for Strategic Planning Reform, SPIR. And he really enjoyed it so much, he asked his staff, apparently, to start engaging with AIFC and SPIR as well. So I was very pleased to hear that as well. So I think it was a great success.
Mm-hmm. And in your opinion, what areas of cooperation need to be strengthened by two countries? Over the first 10 months of this year, bilateral trade grew 30%, reaching $3 billion between these countries.
And you make an interesting point, because bilateral trade did grow this year, you're right, but it grew from having decreased last year. So because of the pandemic last year, bilateral trade had actually fallen quite a bit, because if you go back to 2019, it was at 3.4 billion, and in 2020 it was 2.9 billion, so it fell because of pandemic. So it's good that in 2021 we're seeing a rise back, I think back to the level we were at, and I wanted to take off from there, go further up. I gave a paper to both the presidents about some joint initiatives which will give benefits, I think, to both countries over a wide range of areas, and these included facilitating bilateral trade, as you say, but also industrial cooperation, creating jobs, developing capital markets together, using the AIFC, for example, transport, connectivity, and also vaccine supply. All the areas I thought they could cooperate in. And we gave a long list of initiatives. International Centre for Trade and Economic Cooperation was one of those ideas, trying to use AIFC much more as a Central Asia entity, not just a Kazakhstan entity. We said, let's look at the Tashkent, Shymkent, Turkestan economic corridor as well, border area. We thought both countries should recognize and reduce certifications. So in other words, they should recognize each other's certificates as good enough for them and not ask for their own ones as well. That makes it easier for business. And we thought some climate change, land degradation, Aral Sea sort of issues as well should be tackled, and water issues should be tackled together, and joint tourism programs as well, and vaccine supply, as I said earlier. And some of these initiatives are now under implementation. That's very good, and some of them are under discussion. And so I'm pleased that this is all going ahead, I think. I think the economic corridor in the Tashkent, Shymkent area is one of the real possibilities for changing the cooperation between the two countries. I mean, we need to deal with the constraints that businesses face on the border when they cross the border with each other. And both sides need to do better on that. We have weak infrastructure there, poor connectivity, and I think these can be fixed if there's a political will to do so. And what this visit, I think, of President Mirziyoyev and his discussions with President Tokayev showed is there is a great political will to fix these things. So I'm really quite optimistic now.
Mm-hmm. And also Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have decided to improve bilateral cooperation to a new level, as you mentioned. And Sir, you're just an advisor to the presidents of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Also, in this regard, do you make any analysis on the economic development of these two countries? What would
Absolutely. So I think they're at different stages of development. As I said, if you take the history of the last 30 years, from the Soviet Union collapse and independence of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, we're coming up to the 30th anniversary here in NUR-SULTAN. I think it's quite clear that for those 30 years under the great leadership of Yelbasi and then now President Tokayev, what we've seen is a country in Kazakhstan that's been very open already to investors from abroad, to international ideas. And so for 30 years, Kazakhstan has been growing very well. We've got challenges. We're facing up to the challenges. We will solve those problems. But we've had 30 years of experience of this. Now, in the case of Uzbekistan, for 25 of those 30 years, it was still very closed. It was operating in a different way. It hadn't really moved away from the Soviet approach. And now for 5 years, it's really pushing, it's changing. So it's trying to catch up. But it's a long way to go. A lot of good changes have happened in Uzbekistan already, but there's still quite a lot to catch up. And at the moment, the income level of the two countries is quite different, as I said earlier. But I have great hope because I think in both countries we have leaders who are big reformers, economic reformers. And so the analysis that I've been doing has focused on 3 areas really in both countries, but with different recommendations. First of all, what sort of economic reforms do you need in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to improve the investment climate further, to build more of a market economy, and to really get economic growth moving, but also equitable economic growth? I think that's very important. I do want to place emphasis on equity and on sustainability, really the sustainable development. That's the sort of first pillar of my work in both countries. The second pillar of work is to make our public administration in both countries more effective. I think this is one of the biggest problems we have in both countries, is the public administration quality and capability. So my aim is to improve that more and more. We're sitting here doing this interview in the AIFC. And I think the AIFC is one of the great examples of how you can create a public institution that is actually quite different from the rest, from government in many ways. It is got different ways of working. It's got a much faster, approach to things, and it solves problems more directly. And I should say, I notice also that the management of AIFCs is, I think, just tremendously good. It's as good as you'll find in many Western countries. What we need is more AIFC type approach in both countries. And AIFC can help, but I think we need to take many of the learnings we've taken from here into the government systems in both countries as well. So that's the second area, public administration effectiveness. The third area is about communications and reputation of both countries. I think both countries are becoming more open. You can have a more open discussion publicly. Blogging is happening much more than used to. So you can see that there is more open discussion. This is good. I know it's sometimes difficult for people who grew up in the old system to see this openness and this sometimes very big criticism. That's democracy. And the more you allow it, the more you will have a healthy democracy that actually you can have a debate, you can argue, you can debate. There is no necessarily right answer or wrong answer. There are many answers. And you have to listen to the people. And I think both presidents, President Tokayev and President Mirziyoyev, have said, we want the state to start listening more to the citizens. So I think communications is very, very important in both countries. So the third pillar is very much around how to communicate better as well. And then also how to continue to improve the reputations of both countries internationally as well. So it's a lot of work, but that's what I've been focusing on in my work in both countries.
Sir Suma, massive thank you for your interview and wish you good luck and all the best.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.